It's 1993. India has just liberalized its economy. Foreign companies are flooding in. And Coca-Cola, absent from India for 16 years, is trying to get back into one of the world's largest consumer markets as fast as possible. But this goes back further to 1977. The Indian government demanded Coca-Cola reduce their ownership to 40% and share their secret formula. For Coca-Cola, that formula wasn't just a recipe. It was the entire business. The one thing no competitor had ever been able to copy. Handing it over to a government wasn't a negotiation. It was a surrender. So Coke refused and pulled out of the country entirely. Just like that. What followed was something unusual in global beverage history. India had a massive consumer market. But suddenly, neither Coca-Cola nor Pepsi was in it. And one local entrepreneur filled that gap so completely that by the early 1990s, his brand controlled 60 to 85% of the entire cola market. But before we know more about the entrepreneur, let's talk about the problem Coca-Cola was walking into. Coca-Cola had been out of India for 16 years. No network, no bottlers, no retail presence, nothing. And now they needed to reach the entire country fast. But starting from zero was not an option. India's retail was scattered. Hundreds of millions of consumers spread across cities and remote villages, with no reliable cold storage infrastructure. Building that from scratch would take 10 years, and they simply didn't have 10 years. Because Pepsi had already entered India in 1989 through a partnership deal. With Coke still out of the picture, Pepsi was already on the ground building its network. So they did the only thing that made sense. They bought someone else's network. For $60 million, Coca-Cola acquired the entire Parle Beverages lineup. Thums Up, Limca, Maaza, and Gold Spot, along with 53 bottling plants and a distribution network that reached small grocery stores across India. Now here's how the same deal looked from two very different sides of the table. From Paul's side, the founder was cashing out at exactly the right moment. He could see two global giants with deep pockets coming into his market. Fighting a money war against both of them wasn't realistic. So, he sold while he still had the upper hand. There was no smarter play he could have made. From Coca-Cola's side, the deal was about two things. The distribution network was what they needed. That was the stated value. But Thums Up, the brand itself, was the biggest thing standing between Coca-Cola and owning the Indian market. As long as it existed and stayed strong, Coke couldn't be number one. So, the plan was straightforward. Take the distribution network and kill the brand. One of the first things Coca-Cola did after closing the deal was slash Thums Up's marketing budget from around 15 crore rupees down to just 1.8 crore rupees. Nearly a 90% cut. That was the budget they gave the market leader. That number was clearly a death sentence. Before we get to the murder attempt, you need to understand what this entrepreneur actually built and why it was impossible to replace. Meet Ramesh Chauhan. He was running Parle when Coca-Cola left India in 1977. And instead of copying what Coke had been doing, he asked a different question. What would a cola built specifically for India actually taste like? He wasn't interested in building an imitation of what Coke had been doing. He wanted something built from the ground up, around Indian food, Indian taste, and the reality of Indian infrastructure. Take the carbonation. He pushed it well beyond any standard cola, not just for taste, but for a practical reason. Most Kirana stores had no refrigeration. A regular cola goes flat without the cold. Thums Up didn't. It tasted right straight from a warm shelf at a roadside stall in the middle of a summer afternoon. Built for India as it actually was. Then he built a brand around it that was equally specific. The tagline was "Taste the Thunder." Bold, adult, intensely Indian. And the campaign that did the most strategic work was just 4 words: grow up to thumbs up. A line that quietly changed how an entire generation thought about cola. It built a psychological wall. It framed Pepsi as the teenage drink and Thums Up as what you graduated to. Once that positioning landed in the culture, switching wasn't just a taste question anymore. It was an identity question. By 1993, Thums Up held 60 to 85% of India's cola market. And for most Indians, it wasn't just a drink they picked off a shelf, it was part of who they were. That's what Coca-Cola had just bought and decided to starve. What happened next is the exact opposite of what Coca-Cola expected. From 1993 to 1995, Coca-Cola pushed their bottlers to focus on Coke production. Thums Up's supply started drying up. Retailers who had been stocking it for years were suddenly finding empty shelves. The thinking inside Coca-Cola was simple. Remove Thums Up, and those customers will move to Coke. That's not what happened. When Thums Up drinkers couldn't find their drink, they went straight to Pepsi. Coca-Cola had paid $60 million to dominate India's cola market. But the moment they started suppressing Thums Up, customers didn't pivot to their flagship. They walked straight to the competition. To understand why, you need to look at what Thums Up actually was. Because Coca-Cola was treating it like a brand. It wasn't just a brand. It was 4 walls stacked on top of each other. The first wall was the formula, and it was built into the drink itself. Thums Up's spiced, high carbonation profile paired with Indian food, in a way a sweeter, smoother global cola couldn't. Coca-Cola's formula has been standardized for over a century. They were not going to reformulate for one market. And that meant the gap between the 2 drinks was never going to close. The second wall was distribution, and this one was invisible until it was gone. Thums Up was everywhere, Coke wasn't. Small bottles at 10 to 20 rupees, stocked in every kirana across the country. In smaller cities and towns, it wasn't one of several options. It was often the only cold drink people had ever known. When it disappeared, Coke wasn't there to fill the shelf. Pepsi was. The third wall was memory, and this is where it gets personal. For millions of Indians who grew up in the 1980s, Thums Up was the drink that stayed when the foreign brand left. When Coca-Cola, the same foreign company that had walked out on India once before, started making it disappear, what consumers felt went beyond inconvenience. It felt like something that belonged to them was being taken away. The fourth wall was the hardest to understand and the most expensive to break. Coke was about warmth, family, togetherness. Thums Up was about intensity and challenge. These aren't just different drinks. They represent completely different kinds of people. A Thums Up drinker didn't just prefer a different taste, they saw themselves differently. And you can't ask someone to give up how they see themselves just because a product is out of stock. By 1995, Coca-Cola's own numbers told the full story. When they bought Pal, their combined market share was around 60%. And when Coca-Cola finally looked at the numbers, the actual data from their own market, what they saw should have been impossible. Without Thums Up, that dropped to 28.7%. Over 30 percentage points of pure Thums Up loyalty had walked straight to Pepsi. Without Thums Up, Coca-Cola had cut their own market share in half. Let's stay with 1995 for a moment, because this is where the story turns, and where Coca-Cola loses control. Coca-Cola found themselves in a position that should not have been possible. The brand they were suppressing was the reason they were losing share. The brand they were protecting, their global flagship, was the reason consumers were leaving. There was really only one way out, but it came with an admission that no global brand company ever wants to make. That in India, their world-famous flagship wasn't enough. The local cola would lead while Coke would follow, second in its own portfolio. It took them 2 years to get there, but eventually they accepted it. Thums Up got its full budget back. They brought in Akshay Kumar, sharpened the creative, and leaned harder into what made it distinctly Indian. The positioning was kept completely separate from Coke's global warmth and togetherness. Two brands inside one company, each deliberately going after a different kind of consumer. And here's where it gets really interesting. Pepsi's entire global identity is built around being the bold, challenger, high-energy brand. That emotional territory, intense, adult, confrontational, is exactly where Pepsi needed to plant its flag in India. Thums Up was already there, with years of trust that Pepsi simply couldn't buy, no matter how much they spent. Coca-Cola had gone from trying to kill Thums Up to using it as a wall against their biggest competitor. Now here's the uncomfortable question. What if the suppression had actually worked? If Thums Up died in 1995, Pepsi would have had a clear run into the high-intensity segment with nobody standing in their way. They would have owned the emotional territory their global playbook was built for and locked in an entire generation of Indian consumers at exactly the age when brand habits stick for life. Think about what that would have cost them. The $1 billion in annual revenue, gone. The South Asian expansion, gone. 3 decades of keeping Pepsi locked out of their most important segment. All of it thrown away just to have a cleaner portfolio in a market that had already made up its mind. Coca-Cola delayed 2 years, and every quarter they held onto the wrong strategy. They were directly funding Pepsi's growth. So, what did Coca-Cola actually learn from all of this? Thums Up's moat wasn't brand recognition or a large user base. It was what made it expensive to remove. The drink itself was built around distribution, engineered to work without refrigeration, which meant it could go anywhere. Distribution made the brand ubiquitous before anyone else showed up. Ubiquity built habit. Habit became identity. And when a brand becomes identity, when losing it feels personal, removing it costs the owner more than keeping it alive. Each layer made the others stronger, and that's what makes it nearly impossible to tear down. Ramesh Chauhan sold the business in 1993 and walked away clean. No equity, no board seat, no royalty, no stake in anything that followed. He never saw the $1 billion year. He wasn't in the room for any of it. And yet the decisions he made in the 1970s about carbonation levels, about distribution reach, about what kind of person drinks this, those decisions outlasted him inside the company that tried to erase his brand. That's not a feel-good ending. That's a lesson about what durable actually means. That's what a real moat looks like. Build something specific enough that it feels like it belongs to the people who use it. Get deep into distribution before the big players show up. After that, it becomes a money fight. And money fights have a predictable winner. Make the brand feel like theirs, not just something they buy, but something they'd actually notice losing. Thums Up wasn't unbeatable. It was too expensive to beat. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe.